and welcome to the April 10th, 2023 City Council work session and meeting of the Urban Renewal Agency. It is good to be back. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call work session to order, and I will turn it over to the city manager for the first item.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Good to see everybody again in person. We have two topics tonight. Both of them have urban in it, but one of them really has to do with the edges of our community and one is really about the core. And so the first one is around urban reserves. And I think I'm turning it over to Rebecca to lead us through your next topic.
Thank you. Plug us in. Get started here. Thank you. My name is Rebecca Gershow. I'm a senior planner with the Planning Division here at the city. I'm joined by my colleague, Lindsay Eichner, who's here virtually, as well as my city colleagues who are next to me. Thank you. We're really happy to be here to talk to you about urban reserves. So I'm going to get started and not waste any more time. So we have a brief presentation tonight. We're going to do a refresher on the process undertaken in the urban reserves package, review the staff response memo that's in your package, which is attachment C, and briefly talk about the Planning Commission recommendation and next steps. Council will then deliberate and consider taking action on an ordinance establishing urban reserves for the city of Eugene. For those tuning in to the process tonight, we want to provide a brief refresher as to why we're here and the work to date. Urban reserves planning began in 2018. It's included rigorous technical analysis and suitability analysis components, including 18 meetings with the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee and almost 30 meetings with the elected and appointed officials. A range of urban reserve options were developed, and in fall 2020, the Lane County Board of Commissioners and the Eugene City Council directed staff to initiate the adoption process for the 27-year urban reserve option. An adoption package was assembled that I'll share again in a moment, and the public adoption process began last fall, including mailing almost 4,000 notices to the public. Following the joint City Council Board of Commissioners public hearing that was held on February 28th, the Eugene City Council and the Lane County Board of Commissioners are now considering final adoption of the Urban Reserves Ordinance. So these are the components that make up the Urban Reserves adoption package. They're linked for your reference in your AIS. You'll find them in attachment A following the ordinance. They're also in these binders here, which have been in the City Council office and also available to the public at the Atrium Building. As a courtesy, the complete adoption package is also accessible on the Urban Reserves webpage. The draft City of Eugene ordinance includes amendments in the 3 different plans that are shown here, 11 different intergovernmental agreements regarding coordinated planning between City of Eugene and Lane County, and with 10 statutory special districts whose boundaries are included in urban reserves, and legal findings, which include 5 appendices containing the urban reserve study, technical analysis summary, public engagement summary, and other documents. Here is our map of the proposed urban reserves. This includes just over 5,900 developable acres, which are expected to provide a 27-year supply of developable land, covering a planning period of 2032 to 2059. As directed, This urban reserve does not include the study area's highest value farmland or adjacent properties with higher value soils. This map is included in your AIS as attachment B. So this is what we want to spend some time discussing, the last attachment in your AIS. It's attachment C, the staff response to urban reserves, public testimony, and elected official questions. It responds to the questions that were raised at the February joint officials public hearing and in written testimony. And plus there were 2 questions from elected officials. Overall, we received about 75 submissions at the time of publication, and our testimony has been fairly evenly split between those in support of urban reserves, those concerned about it, and those with questions or general input. The 16-page memo covers questions related to how we treated different habitat types and wetlands, Goal 5 analysis, how we counted developable land, middle housing, questions related to the Metro Plan, and some property-specific questions. Instead of walking through the memo question by question, we wanted to leave enough time for your questions in order to aid in your deliberations. We also attached an additional memo. It's labeled C1. It was given to the Planning Commission prior to their recommendation because some of the testimony we received was echoed previously in that memo. So overall, there were good substantive questions raised, and this process gave staff the opportunity to further explain some of the important information in the analysis. None of the testimony we received necessitated adjustment of the proposed adoption package. The staff response memo, as you'll see, references the places in the analysis and in state law where these issues have been addressed, and it also provides additional clarification on the variety of topics. City and county staff were able to review the memo with DLCD staff last week, Department of Land Conservation and Development staff, including their housing and Goal 5 specialists. It was a great meeting. We shared the response to testimony with them, and they were very positive in their feedback related to the urban reserves analysis and the approach that we had taken. At the February 15th work session with City Council, some councilors had questions about the proposed Metro Plan policy in the adoption package that directs staff to, the quote is, review the sufficiency of urban reserves no later than 10 years after Eugene's first UGB expansion following the adoption of urban reserves. This is the last question in the staff response memo. We provided additional information there, but we also got a request at that meeting to see a graphic with some overlapping timelines of related and upcoming work. And so we've provided this very simplistic graphic. The first line here, as you can see, shows our ongoing growth monitoring work. Then it shows urban reserves being adopted this year. Then it shows our work updating the urban growth boundary, which is also beginning this year, with adoption by 2026. And that's a deadline that is imposed by the state. So it's important to note that the UGB related work is highly simplified here. What's important for this discussion is if a UGB expansion is necessary, it will need to happen by the end of 2026, which is the adoption deadline the state's given us. Therefore, per the proposed policy, the review of urban reserves would need to be initiated no later than 10 years after that, if an expansion in fact happened in 2026. So you can see this urban reserves review floating over here on the right-hand side because the exact timing is uncertain since it's dependent on the UGB expansion or on whether or when elected officials may direct staff to do this work, if there's a reason to begin the work sooner than the deadline in the policy. So this past December, the Eugene Planning Commission, following the County Planning Commission, unanimously passed a motion recommending that the city council approve the proposed urban reserves adoption package, which meets the needs of approximately 27 years of growth, with specific changes that responded to the public testimony that was received at that time. The urban reserves ordinance under consideration by city council includes these changes that were recommended by the Planning Commission. So next steps are the council and board are both deliberating separately. Obviously, the council tonight with the board scheduled for tomorrow at their 1:30 time certain. And we will cut off the presentation now and open it up for questions. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I will just say I appreciate in particular that very simple timeline at the end, because it is pretty hard to hold this sequence of things in our heads. So I very much appreciate that. Are there questions or comments from council? Alan and then Randy.
So that last part, is it the adoption of the UGB or expansion of the UGB that triggers the 10-year timeline?
Good question. So what the state is requiring that we do is adopt a UGB by the end of 2026. But the policy is 10 years after our first UGB expansion following urban reserves adoption. So that's why we don't have a specific date here, because we don't yet know if we're going to expand them.
Right. If we don't expand the UGB in that time frame, then it doesn't trigger.
Correct.
Right.
Right.
Which makes sense, because those two things should go together.
Right, because we won't have information to base a decision on urban reserves if we haven't yet had to change urban reserves in order to expand the UGB.
Yeah. I wanted to compliment you on the packet. I actually read all of it and didn't even nod off. And it was very informative, especially the answers to the questions that came up. And I thought it was very thorough. And in the end, all of this work, the responses to the questions only triggered one minor thing that got changed. Other than that, everything else was more or less is being adopted as proposed.
Right. So the responses to questions at the Planning Commission stage resulted in a few recommendations in the packet that you received, the adoption packet.
Right.
The only change to the proposed urban reserve was removing the 17 acres of Wildish owned land. There were some changes and refinement to our analysis, but that was the one change I believe that you're referring to.
That was my next question, so thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Randy, then Matt, then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. And Rebecca, I too want to commend you and your team on the work you did on preparing this. And it's been really impressive to watch as we've progressed through this process. I too read the whole packet. I can't say I absorbed all of it to the extent I would like to, but I do understand it. I guess my question is more towards the future. How long does it take us, for example, if we have some economic development changes that spur the need for more workforce housing, things like that. How fast in the future, once we adopt this, can we get back to the table to talk about how we can expand and add additional urban reserves if we don't use all that? I mean, what is the process and what kind of timeline on a fast track would we be looking at?
So we're already starting our UGB analysis process. We're working on developing our buildable lands inventory. And I would say that work that needs to be adopted by 2026 is critical to informing us whether or not our urban reserves is working, or sort of how on track we are. Is it the right amount of land? We know it's an approximate. the 27 year. But to know whether it's generally enough, I'd say we need to go through this, this adoption process of the next UGB specifically. And at that point, we also have our growth monitoring process in place, and we will have our new middle housing code acknowledged by the state, and we will have more, better, newer capacity information to be able to use to evaluate how quickly we'll be able to grow.
So I'm still trying to get a sense, once we've gone through all that, if we have some triggers that say, oops, we didn't think big enough,
Sure.
and we have to start all over again, how fast can that be done? And how does that actually get triggered?
How fast? Okay.
I
Emily's
don't
going-
think anyone can tell you, 2 years or 3 years, I mean, or
Okay.
6 months. But I will say this, the example that we have, the one example that took a really long time, our previous UGB expansion, is not even remotely comparable in the time it took. And here's why. We had a shared urban growth boundary with Springfield prior to that time. And we were establishing at that time our own, which meant we had to, from nothing, create a buildable lands inventory for just Eugene, an economic opportunities analysis just for Eugene. And, the list goes on of the basis documents that you have to have in place in order to do the math, in order to do the figuring. Those are now in place. And not only that, you've required, and staff has really done very well on creating tools to just simply keep those updated. So when you think about how long it took last time, a lot of it was in creating those basic things. The other thing is, if in fact urban reserves passes, the analysis of the land now becomes a much more streamlined process, because a lot of the analysis that had to be done last time, as we've talked about a lot in this room in this project, won't need to be done this time because it's in what you are asked to adopt tonight. And a lot of the land has been, everything that's in urban reserves is elevated up to first priority. So we don't have to go through the process of describing why all this other land isn't appropriate. A lot of it's not even in urban reserves. And then within urban reserves, we already know that it's probably buildable. We'll look closer. And at the time of expansion, you'll be looking at it for housing or for employment or for a park or school. And we have so much information about the land. So I'm not giving you how long it will take, but it won't be like last time.
Okay, that's what's worrying me. I'm concerned with us being able to respond quick enough to opportunities that may present themselves in the future. Another point and question. I'm used to in my former life benchmarking against similarly sized cities and organizations of similar complexities. And I've always found that very valuable. Have we compared ourselves to our closest comparable city, Salem?
In terms of urban
Just
reserves?
Urban reserves and processes. The reason I'm asking, and I realize all the state buildings up there, I'm sure contributed to this, but basically their city limits are almost 10% bigger than ours. I mean, it's the better part of 5 square miles, and you can fit a lot of housing, a lot of commercial, tax producing properties that support the entire city into 5 square miles. And although we don't have all the state buildings Salem has, we do have a lot of large wetland areas that are included in our 44 point whatever square miles, but they're not buildable.
One of the challenges of urban reserves planning is that not many communities in the state have done it. Metro did it. So there's a very large urban reserves around the Portland metropolitan area, but the few other ones are in much smaller communities. So we have really sort of set the bar for how we do that type of planning. In terms of UGB analysis planning, there's a lot of great examples to go on, but at the same time, I wasn't here in 2017 when our last UGB was adopted, but I know Eugene really does it. Again, sets the bar for the type of analysis needed. And we are a special case in many ways, and I will stop there.
We're always special.
Good to be special.
Well, thank you. I guess we'll just have to kind of watch this, but I hope, city manager, we keep that in mind. It doesn't seem like we're very nimble, and especially when you look at opportunities that may or may not be coming down the pike, some of those require us being very nimble. And if we aren't, we're going to lose opportunities. So anyhow, that's my point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and then Mike.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, and not surprisingly, I'm also going to express a concern, a little different than Councilor Groves. I turn to attachment C, page 10. And my concern revolves around the major big game habitat and the peripheral big game habitat, especially the land that goes from Dillard Road, that hugs Dillard Road and goes all the way to I-5 and even goes to the I-5 Highway 58 interchange. Talking about land that's north and south of 30th. Significant swath of this land has been indicated by ODFW as major big game habitat. In our attachment, it's illustrated that big game habitat, both major and peripheral big game habitat, covers 40% or approximately 11,088 acres of urban reserve study area that we're considering. And I would argue that roughly 95% of the major big game habitat is in those South Hills around the aforementioned area, Dillard Road, north and south of 30th, all the way throughout LCC to I-5. My question revolves around a couple things. In staff response on the previous page, it's indicated that the city and county could have, pursuant to OAR 660-021-0010 and 0030, determined that these big game habitat areas are, quote, undevelopable, and therefore not among the acres that could serve as part of the 27-year study of urban reserves developable land. That sentence is written in the past tense, could have. Can council, either now or into the future, determine that those lands are undevelopable based on ODFW study?
Yeah.
A couple things. I do want to point out that what you're reading from was staff's response in front of the Planning Commission. And I would, you probably have read the more updated and thorough response that is in the packet in response to the same issue for you. It doesn't eliminate that from being a good question. I wouldn't want to defend that. The problem that we have with big game right now is it's kind of a question mark. And I think the legal risk of discounting it completely or even assigning it incredibly low development potential, as you're urged to by Mr. Close, is harder to defend than what we're doing here, which is just marking it as urban reserve, that which actually looks like it could be developable. And as you read, a lot of it actually is not being included in urban reserves for other reasons, probably all the same reasons that deer and elk like it. It's steep, it's heavily wooded, and I think that right now, the fact that ODFW has this stuff mapped, it doesn't mean that it's not buildable. It means that we should look at it and apply protection measures. The county's protection measures as a result of a recent LUBA case, mean that they have to assign 1 unit per 40 acres or 1 unit per 80 acres, depending on the zoning. That's not what we would need to do. We would look at it and balance it for what it might be useful for in terms of the city. You could at that point say it's far too valuable as habitat for these critters. We don't want to make it developable. You will have that opportunity at urban growth boundary. I don't feel like it would be legally defensible to make that determination now.
All right, Mike and then Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to, just for the public's sake, if no one else is, delve into something Emily Jerome said just a little while ago under one of Randy's questions about process. When it comes to, what we did previously with UGB, everything had to start from scratch, and the systems need to be built for counting, not just doing the counting. But towards the end of that, you mentioned, Emily, that a lot of this work is to predetermine the types of land, and thus to say we can't build here, we can't build there, we might be able to build over here. And what I'm interested in is if you can maybe give further detail and explain to the public the difference between a UGB, setting a UGB and establishing it, and the work we're doing with urban reserves. In other words, are we at the point where we would say, nope, you can't build over here, but on what basis would we say you can't build over here? Does that cover everything?
I might check back with you and make sure I'm answering your question, because I'm not
Sure.
sure I understand at the end. But
We're defining all the lands that are undevelopable and known to us with the
That's
urban
right.
training. Is that
in
correct?
a big way, what we're doing right here is identifying the land that should stay in rural use. That it doesn't appear that we as a city are going to grow onto that land in the next 50 years. Is that right? 50? 27 plus however many we have left in our urban growth boundary. So, urban growth, the way that the boundaries work, are you have city limits, and that is where things get built. Land is annexed into the city from within a larger boundary called the urban growth boundary. And the urban growth boundary defines the amount of land when we set it that we think we're going to need for the next 20 years of growth. This process goes out even further and says, we think that this land in urban reserves will be what we will choose from as we need to add more land to our urban growth boundary. So there's two additional steps that would need to be taken for a piece of land to go from where it is right now being tagged an urban reserve to development. And it will never be forced upon anybody to develop. In this city, we generally don't annex unless someone comes to us and says, I'd like to be part of the city. Now, Mike, I don't know if that gets where you were wanting me to go.
But not really. What I'm looking at is the tests that we're giving. We're saying this land over here that we have not included in urban reserves is because is it not what we think will be needed for urbanization within a period of time, or is it that we can't build here?
It is, there's a very, very in-depth study, and I'm actually going to have Rebecca speak to that, but it is some of both. The law specifically says there are certain things we know we can never build on. And those are areas where, there's identified protective measures applied to the land, often because of, it actually already has been mapped and identified as wetland.
Whatever, yeah.
There is a second test. There's two levels of test. There's a second test for suitability. And that also has some prescriptive 4 different factors that you have to consider under the law. There is some give and take among those. They're balanced. And maybe Rebecca, you can talk a little about the suitability analysis.
Sure. The suitability analysis are the 18 different reports that are included as an attachment to the study, where we picked the land that was suitable to select urban reserves from, or by default, we removed the land from consideration that we identified as not suitable.
Can you list those things for the public's benefit? Can you list what's unsuitable?
The areas in the study that were unsuitable?
The qualifications.
The bases
For the qualifications.
Thank
So
you.
it had to be efficient, allow for efficient urbanization. It had to allow for economic, sorry, I'm not reading it. I'm trying to remember the exact wording. Economic serviceability. So ease of serviceability was a big factor. There were the easy analysis considerations, which is environmental, economic, energy, and social considerations. So those were all discussed together and balanced. And then there were considerations of how it would affect adjacent farmland and forest land.
Gotcha.
So we had, those are the 4 different locational factors of goal 14 from the state, which is urbanization. And so those are the different evaluation criteria that we had to balance for all of the land. And we simply split it up into these study areas for ease of evaluation. But we looked at the land that had similar geographic considerations. And in some cases, like in many of the South Hills sub areas, much of the farther outlying land was considered unsuitable for the reasons you would probably expect. It was difficult to serve. It was difficult environmentally. It was forested. It was very sloped. There were water issues. It was hard to access. It was high topography. So there were a lot of overlapping issues. And I would say most of those areas in the South Hills that weren't completely removed in the suitability analysis, the outer laying areas or lands were. And then
So
there
by
were other considerations as well.
So by contrast, those included could be considered suitable for environmental reasons.
Correct. So the lands that were left in were considered suitable. Some were more suitable than others, but they had to overall pass the test of suitability. And then we selected urban reserves from those lands by the land prioritization system. So first we selected residential, commercial, or industrial designated land. Then we selected marginal land, which is land that is a little bit better, but not good enough for growing things on. And then the last priority was agricultural and forest land. So we had to bring those lands based on the land need into urban reserves in that order.
We've received a lot of emails about oak savannas
Yes.
and those being included in lands that were considered environmentally suitable.
Right.
So can you explain the analysis there?
Yeah, I can briefly. Thank you. Yes, there are specific inventories that we could consider for urban reserves analysis. Some were designated in the UGB analysis guidance. Most of the land we considered with natural resource considerations had goal 5 protections on them. So they were included in an inventory, either a local, like West Eugene Wetlands Plan, a local, a state, or a federal inventory, because we had to be able to identify that land on a parcel by parcel basis. We did not have that type of information for oak savanna or oak woodlands because they are not a goal 5 protected habitat resource. That said, if we need to consider some of that land to bring it into the UGB, we can do a more detailed, in-depth, easy analysis, which is the goal 5 analysis, which is very similar to what we did with the last UGB expansion, where we brought in lands in the Clear Lake area. I hope that answered your question.
It kind of does. There's one more step to it, which is, so the UGB process itself has a whole new process of excluding lands that are not suitable for building at a different level of analysis. Am I right about that?
We are going to be, yes, we're going to be delving down into a deeper level of analysis for the UGB, for the land that we bring into the UGB. So we're going to be trying to identify the land that's the most suitable first. But we will need to look at that land because there are constraints, honestly, on all of the land surrounding the UGB. So we'll need to evaluate it for its different constraints and for its different and most appropriate suitability once again. But as Emily said, we've done a lot of that first level of work. We're doing this in stages. And so we've done the first bar, and then we need to get to the next
Sure.
level with the UGB
Yeah.
analysis.
Anybody want to forecast the percentage of reserve land that remains after the UGB process that's not excluded?
No,
Emily?
I do not.
Anybody want to make a guess, wild number, anything?
How many
'Cause-
decimal places, Mike?
Well, just one's fine, but you know, I just want to give people a general idea. Hey, we're going to cut out, 50% of this anyway in the UGB process.
Well, I think it's really, we haven't done that analysis and it's really difficult to say. And what we feel confident in saying is that the UGB process will be a better process with urban reserves in place than it would have been without urban reserves in place. We feel really confident that we're going to be able to select land for different uses in a much more compressed, compact, adjacent to the UGB manner, much more efficient to serve and to develop than if we were really only restricted to our rural residential or rural commercial lands, which were our first priority lands if we didn't have an urban reserve. So I'm not saying it's going to be a simple process by any means, but I think the outcome will be better.
Better? Could you define better?
Faster.
Not additionally than what I just said.
Okay. I have 20 seconds and a whole nother line of questioning. So Mayor, will you put me down for another round, please?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
All right. And Greg.
Yeah. So I'm going to follow up on Councilor Keating and Councilor Clark's questions and remarks, because as I kind of delved into this and the response to Bill Cluse's question around the big game habitat, in my mind, and maybe you can help clarify for me, because in my mind, the big game is already there in places where we have already built residential development, and we placed LCC 55 or 56 years ago, right smack dab in the middle of that, on top of an old landfill. So help me understand, what protections are we looking with the county to put in place around big game when big game is already roaming around? And I've got, wild turkeys, not the drink, the real turkeys, cougars, deer, et cetera, that are just, prancing around 30th Avenue and through everything already. What specifically are we doing to protect that wildlife? Or are we saying that because we have already built in this area that we don't have, or we don't need additional protections for that wildlife if we decide to classify this as urban reserves?
I'm going to jump in just because
Okay.
the big game issue is kind of a legal issue at this point. But just to be clear, all the land in urban reserves is not in your jurisdiction. Everything we're
It's
talking about,
county.
it's all county, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of what we have the power to do or what we might do, nothing while it's in urban reserves. We could urge the county to study its land more, and we could urge it to do more study on the habitats. I don't know if they'll do that or not, but one of the big issues is because of a recent court ruling, The county's changing the way it looks at those lands. So for a very, very long time, the county's been allowing housing and things like this on those lands. And they thought that that was okay. And, you know, Landwatch and a few other organizations have been challenging their allowance of these template dwellings and various things, and have gotten the courts to say, hey, county, you actually have a policy that says you're going to develop protection measures for them. And until you've done it, you're going to apply these 1 to 40 or 1 to 80 acres dwellings. And it looks like you didn't actually ever do those protection measures you were talking about. So now, but in the meantime, the county has a lot of impact. And those impacted lands are part of the reason why we can't just say that this land isn't developable. A lot of it's already been developed.
Yeah.
Right. So the answers to your questions are really only the county could answer those questions for now. We, I think you've heard as a staff, and also will be required by law, are committed to looking at those things, at that habitat at the time we're considering bringing the land in as potential developable land for urban growth boundary. At this point in time, you know, it's possible that oak savanna, habitat, all these things could get listed, identified during the time between your action on this and urban growth boundary expansion. And that information will be very useful when we go to urban growth boundary, but it's not really ours to do at this point. Nothing we do affects that habitat in this process. Everything stays as is. It's literally just a map you're adopting.
Okay. So then if we are just adopting the map, we are not proposing any annexation into the city or that particular section as we move forward with urban reserves.
That's right. That's far down the line.
Okay. I think I'm more clear now.
Okay, Emily.
Thank you. This is a huge amount of work. Look at those 3 notebooks. I didn't even know notebooks came that fast. So thank you for this. It's taken years. What I really appreciated from the AIS was the answer to the questions about what you've just been talking about, the habitat for big game, wetlands, and oak. I think they're really legitimate concerns. But what I think people don't understand is we're not making any real decisions today. These are a lot of research to see which areas might be most appropriate. But it won't be until we get to the point where we'd actually be needing to consider which more land we need, because then we would be doing more in-depth studies. This has already been a lot, but we're not taking it down to the very detailed stuff because we haven't had the time, and it's not time yet. So I really appreciated the answers and the thoroughness, and that I could see how people might stretch it a lot and go, oh, we're going to kill all the oak trees. No, we're not. We might not even take on the oak trees, or we don't know yet. We'll study it. So thank you. I think that calmed me down. I hope it did for other people too. And I've got to thank you for wildlife prancing around. Let Eugene be known for that.
Okay,
You wait till you have to meet a wild turkey.
I have 2 counselors wanting a second round. So, okay, so first Alan and then Mike.
Yeah, I was intrigued by something that Randy said, the need to act fast. I think the process isn't set up to actually do that, nor should it be, in that there's a 20-year supply built into this process, right? So that we're looking at the urban growth boundary is supposed to give us a 20-year supply of housing and commercial and industrial and parks and schools. And so we determine whether or not there is sufficient amount of that. It's hard to imagine a circumstance where we would actually have such a dramatic shift that it would create an insufficiency of available lands. Although your predecessor talked about, you know, it would be great if we could do this on a real-time basis and have it be happen more quickly and have it be an ongoing process of what the UGB actually looks like, not exactly a realistic one. I mean, it's not that precise. If we build one house, or if we build one industrial facility, arguably then we have instantly a less than a 20-year supply. But because it's not that precise, we do it on a more measured basis and we do it on a periodic basis that we look at this, because it is, like every 5 years, and look at this stuff and make sure that we have an adequate amount to address all those needs. The benefit to me of having an urban reserve, and why I like it, is that it streamlines the process. It takes a lot of the work about where do we look first, and we did that in the urban reserves process. So then we go and look at those parcels of land, all the orange pieces on the map, because we've already done that work. We've narrowed the pool. I guess my question is, what's the process that once we go through that and we say, okay, we need to increase the urban growth boundary for one of those 4 needs? What's the process for going from urban reserves to urban growth, including it in the urban growth boundary?
Right. So
it's a whole new set of work, but we limited the universe, really, right?
Right, exactly. And so we'll find out what we're expanding for and how many acres we're expanding, and we'll analyze the areas in the urban reserves that would be the most suitable for those. And then we would compare them and do this goal 14 analysis for those specific areas, and do any additional studies if there is identified natural resources on those sites. And that's generally it. And then bring it to decision makers.
To match the need that we've identified.
Yes, the need piece happens first.
Yes, right. And then we go look where those appropriate lands are. And then what's the process is there a process for looking at the lands that we've excluded at this point through the urban reserves, or are they just out forever? So we redo it?
Not exactly.
Every time we talk about this, then, 2 years later, there's a change in the law, and what I said doesn't, but assuming the law stays the same. Urban reserves, exception land, and what's the third category? There are other lands when you're going to do an urban growth boundary expansion that you look at, not just the urban reserves, but we've already looked at it and decided that stuff wasn't suitable. So that we'll just pull from our study and update it. So it's not as if, and the other thing is you can always look at other land.
Okay.
If you have a willing property owner who says, I want to develop, and this seems like a great idea, and they're not in urban reserves, it doesn't mean you cannot look at that as an expansion area.
Right. So it's not excluded forever.
Right.
It's just for this purposes of drawing this map, these are the areas we're going to look at first.
Yeah. If it's just a legislative look about where we should grow, this is where we'll concentrate.
And we've clarified places where we wouldn't.
Yeah.
Correct.
Right.
Okay, Mike.
I had 1 second.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just.
Hate to jump the gun on you. Mike, second round.
Thank you, Mayor. Al and I are thinking about this similarly with regard to process. My question for Emily is a little bit different. The governor has made the promise that we will have 36,000 new houses. I don't know the time frame. We tend towards, unless I'm mistaken on this assumption, somewhere around, 10% state when such goals are made. So I'm just using that for the sake of argument. If we're going to build 3,600 new single-family homes, I would think that would be rather challenging, considering that so far we've only permitted something like 91 this year. My understanding, let me say that differently. I don't understand the governor's process by which she's promising to get there. My understanding and what I've heard from people is some sort of extra legislative process about bringing new lands in and making them buildable by fiat, by executive order, or by some process I'm unaware with. you, Emily, are probably more aware than I of the law in this case and what the governor has proposed. Can you talk about that and how that might affect what we're doing?
I am not prepared to do that. I would be happy to do that in another time or write an email or a memo or something to try to respond, but
Can the governor change the UGB by fiat?
I do not know of a way that that could be done without a change in the law.
But there is a bill that for industrial lands for the chip manufacturing, which limits it to 6 different locations across the state.
Right.
That could be outside the UGB and be brought in.
Right, the
by-
legislature has taken actions like that in the past, but just you know, an action from the governor, I'm not aware of how that could happen, but I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I know the answers to your questions right now, because I just don't, Mike.
Okay. I'm interested in us preparing adequately for what the governor may do. I would love to see success in homes being built as we're in the middle of a crisis. However, I'm hearing these promises. I could use some education from knowledgeable staff folks about how they might take place and how it interacts with our process. Does anybody want to add to that conversation? One
Councilor
at a
Clark,
time, though, please.
This is Alyssa Hanson, Planning Director. I have
Yeah.
been tracking some of that and be happy to follow up with you. There's a number of different actions going on at different levels, whether it's, you know, asking for rulemaking, or there's some new statutes about long range planning. There are a number of things kind of in the works, and some of them aren't even decided yet. So I think we'll know a lot more at the end of the session.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there any way, without having to search for a work session poll, that we might get an update on this? And I guess I'm asking Sarah now. I appreciate very much when staff provides helpful memos like these, but I want the public to understand what we're going to be able to do and not able to do. And I want us to be clear about what we can do and what we can't do, and what the governor's promising, and what we might be able to depend on and what we might not. Is there a way we can get that information out in the public and in this conversation, Sarah?
You're like, anybody? I'm not totally understanding the level of analysis you want us to do, so that's why I'm sitting back trying to understand exactly what the question is. So I think it would be helpful to follow up with you after this, so I can really understand what I'm committing to.
And I know it's complex because they're political promises right now and they're not actual policy changes. But as policies change, I just suppose what I want to say is I sure hope that our process is to be as public and transparent and out loud as possible about what we know, when we know it, about what to expect and how it may or may not interact this process. So I guess that was more of a, hey, are we going to talk about this out loud?
I would, just remind you that you are continuing to get regular updates from Ethan about what is happening at the legislature, and you have an opportunity through the IGR to ask for more clarification on the progress of any proposed legislation. So for the immediate future, that's a pathway to sort of tracking what's exactly happening at the legislative level. And then when this session is over, then as Alyssa has said, we'll know more.
And it will be a report to council, Sarah?
Yeah, you're receiving regular reports from Ethan on
by email, yeah. But
yeah.
I'm talking about our out loud discussion.
So Greg is the IGR chair, and he provides those reports, and so he can provide that substantive information. Yes.
Yeah, we should have an update coming fairly soon.
Right.
We canceled this
very much.
The last meeting, so we'll be back soon.
Okay. Thank you. So I think if there are no other questions or comments, we have a motion to go on the table.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to adopt an ordinance establishing urban reserves for the city of Eugene, amending the Eugene Springfield Metropolitan Area General Plan, amending the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, amending the Eugene Springfield Metropolitan Area Public Facilities and Services Plan and providing an effective date.
Second.
You want to speak to it? Matt, go ahead.
Mayor, I'd like the floor to amend slightly, if I could, please.
You are free to do that.
Move to amend pursuant to OAR 660-021-0010 and -0300. Lands determined as major big game habitat, as ODFW's maps include in our AIS, are undevelopable.
Is there a second for that? Okay, I don't think you have a second.
I don't think so.
You'll have a chance to come back to that as described at a later point.
Thank you.
All right, so the original motion is on the table. It's been seconded. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 opposed. 1, 2, Mike, you're opposed?
Sorry about that, having microphone and camera problems. I'm in favor. Thank you.
You're in favor. Okay, so that's 7 in favor, 1 opposed. So that passes. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much for the work, the research, the clear AIS. That was just incredibly helpful. Really appreciate your work
So much.
and your capacity to answer those questions. So we have
Overnight success.
an overnight
10 years.
success. Right, overnight in 10 years.
That's what worries me.
Wow, this isn't the same process.
We should have one.
We get coffee, I think.
No.
Did Emily go?
It's going on. Okay.
Yeah, well, we talked about this, right? Okay, well, there's a certain amount of shifting. I will, at the very least, close out the city council session and open the meeting of the Eugene Urban Renewal Agency. And think I can turn it over to the manager to open the topic.
Sure. Thank you. We're here to talk about downtown urban renewal. We anticipated that one or both of these work sessions might go a little bit long. So we do have some time held on Wednesday. If you don't complete today and we need to spill over to Wednesday, we're able to do that. And I think I'm turning it over to Will Dowdy.
Good evening. My name is Will Dowdy. I'm the Community Development Director. I'm here with Amanda D'Souza, our Development Programs Manager. We're excited to be back to talk about urban renewal with you. As you recall, urban renewal, this conversation began with a council poll about what to do with the 2 urban renewal districts that we have as they both get to the end of a phase and it's time to start thinking about the future. So we're here. It's been a long road to get here with a lot of public engagement, a number of conversations with you, but we're here to take the next step. And with that, Amanda, take it away.
Thanks, Will. I'll quickly start with a summary of the existing downtown urban renewal district. The current spending limit, also known as maximum indebtedness, is $66 million. It was last increased with the 2016 amendment, which added $19.4 million. In general, urban renewal funds can be used for the purchase of real property, rehab or construction of buildings, site improvements, and improvements to streets, sidewalks, and utilities, essentially anything associated with capital improvements. Projects associated with operations like street cleaning or public safety services are not eligible. The Downtown Urban Renewal Plan was last amended in 2016 when eligible activities were limited to 4 specific projects, each with their own spending cap, and in 2020 when the farmers market spending cap was removed. The district expires when the spending limit is met, which is forecast to happen this December. To remind you what's included in the district, I'll bring up the district map. This is also included on the last page of attachment E. The district goes west to Lincoln, north to 6th Avenue, south to 11th, and generally out east to Pearl, but also including the former City Hall block, which was added in 2016. I'll start walking through the draft proposed amendment, which is in attachment A. Attachment B is the draft report on the downtown urban renewal plan, which provides information on the current conditions of the district and the financial impact of the proposed amendment. Both the plan and the report are required by Oregon statutes that enable urban renewal. There are two pieces I'll cover today, the project focus areas and the spending scenarios. To determine what projects would be included in the proposed amendment, we adapted the approach currently used in the Riverfront Urban Renewal Plan, which includes project focus areas, that outline eligible activities, which turn into projects as the plan is implemented. This strategic approach would allow you to establish spending parameters now, while maintaining some flexibility and responsiveness as needs evolve or conditions change during implementation. To identify the project focus areas, we look to the downtown priorities and projects efforts from last fall. Based on what we heard, the proposed amendment includes 3 proposed focus area buckets: housing, physical improvements to increase safety and comfort, and emerging projects which would be initiated by you, the agency board. I'll talk through these in a little bit more detail, give examples of possible outcomes, and briefly touch on what implementation could look like if you do choose to amend the plan. During the public outreach last fall, housing emerged as one of the important priorities in downtown. We heard it was important the city support the creation of a mix of new housing affordable across income levels. To help address this bucket includes 2 new possible projects to support the creation of housing. The first is development fee assistance, which would pay for government-imposed development fees for new housing, such as system development charges and permit fees. The second is real property acquisition, which would allow the agency board to acquire property and offer it for reduced or no cost for new housing development. Both of these efforts help to offset construction costs to make housing projects financially feasible. Some examples of what that could look like. With development fee assistance, we hope to make it financially feasible for more projects like the Park Place Apartments to move forward, which converted offices into residential units. With land acquisition, the city would be able to acquire and offer private and public properties for housing. Some publicly owned properties that might be good fits for new housing are the McHale site behind the library or the property north of the new Farmers Market Pavilion. Should the plan be approved later this year, both projects would require agency board direction and decisions before they could be implemented. For the development fee assistance, staff would work with the agency board to establish the program, including eligibility criteria. An agency board action would be required before acquiring or offering any real property for housing. The next bucket is physical improvements to increase safety and comfort. This allows the agency to make physical improvements to street, curb, sidewalks, and other right-of-way in the plan area to create safe, accessible, and welcoming spaces for users. Improvements could include street, curb, alley, and sidewalk improvements, streetscape projects, or pedestrian, bike, and transit improvements. Some examples of ways we can address safety and comfort include installing lighting in alleys, fixing pavements and sidewalks, and adding plantings and landscaping throughout the district. If the proposed plan amendment was approved, projects in this bucket would be implemented on an as-needed basis. Agency board approval would be needed for any projects over $250,000. This is the same threshold and approach currently used in the Riverfront Urban Renewal Plan. The third focus area bucket is referred to as emerging projects, which would be directed or initiated by the agency board. These can be considered projects that align with the downtown priorities and that the agency board could pursue in the medium to long term, in contrast to the housing and physical improvement projects, which we expect will begin being implemented in the nearer term. This bucket could include supporting the development of community facilities, such as convention center improvements or expansion. The agency board could also choose to pursue revitalization of open spaces, including implementation of projects identified in the 2016 Projects for Public Spaces report, Places for People, like redevelopment of the park blocks. And finally, the agency board could provide financial assistance to support the revitalization of vacant storefronts and underutilized properties. If the proposed plan amendment were approved, the agency board would need to provide direction before any of these projects could move forward. All three require additional study and strategy before they could be pursued. By including them in the plan amendment now, these projects become eligible for urban renewal funds, meaning the agency board can choose to initiate them without having to amend the plan. The proposed amendment includes information on 3 possible spending scenarios, each of which have a different increase to the spending limit or maximum indebtedness. I'll walk through what is included in the proposed amendment, including possible allocations between the 3 buckets. Scenario A would increase the spending limit by $30 million. In this scenario, the bulk of the funds would be allocated to housing, with smaller amounts in physical improvements and emerging projects. We estimate that if half the $14 million was allocated to development fee assistance, we would be able to support the creation of up to 700 new residential units. You'll also note that if you do some quick math, the bucket amounts don't add up to 30 million, and that's because the 30 million includes project delivery, program administration, and borrowing costs. In scenario B, the spending limit increases 40 million. The allocation for housing remains at 14 million, with additional allocations to physical improvements and emerging projects. In scenario C, the spending limit increase is 50 million, with additional allocations to all 3 buckets. Under this scenario, again, assuming approximately half the housing dollars are allocated to development fee assistance, we estimate the agency could support the creation of up to 840 new units. The final piece of information, the column on the right, shows how long we estimate the district would be extended for each of these 3 scenarios, ranging from 11 to 19 years. I'll remind you that these are just example spending scenarios and allocations. You can choose to move forward with one of these spending scenarios, propose an alternative scenario, blend a couple of these scenarios, or propose other bucket allocations to reflect agency board priorities. The only thing that gets locked in if the plan is amended is the spending limit increase. The allocation between buckets does not place limits between the focus areas. They are estimates to help guide the planning effort. I'll touch on what the fiscal implications would be, whether or not the plan is amended. If the plan is amended, and therefore the district extended, based on fiscal year 22 data, approximately $2.6 million in tax increment revenue will continue to be collected every year and grow, and could be spent on eligible projects. If the plan is ultimately not amended and the agency discontinues the collection of tax increment, the funds would be directed to overlapping taxing districts. Again, based on fiscal year 22 data, under this scenario, the city general fund would receive about 1.3 million, and the county would receive about $235,000. Approximately $880,000 would be collected on behalf of School District 4J, but due to property tax compression and state funding mechanisms, 4J would see a net decrease of $150,000 to their budget should tax increments stop being collected. At the last work session, we said we'd explore the feasibility of boundary expansion. As we mentioned then, there are some limitations in the state statutes that cap the amount of boundary expansion we can incur from the inception of the district. Any expansion that occurs reduces the capacity for future expansion, even if the boundary contracts somewhere else. The proposed plan amendment does not include any boundary changes. Given the strict rules about expansion and the need for the agency board to make a decision on the amendment by June, the proposed amendment assumes that further decisions about boundary expansion options would be done in a later process after this amendment is complete. This will preserve the agency's expansion capacity and allow you to pursue it thoughtfully and opportunistically. If you want to keep exploring the use of urban renewal in the downtown, the next step would be to formally initiate the plan amendment process today. Should you do that, we would then incorporate any feedback you have into the draft amendment, notify the general public about the proposed amendment, seek concurrence from overlapping taxing districts, take the amendment to Planning Commission, and hold a public hearing. You'd then have another work session estimated for early June to review recommendations and public comment and further refine the amendment if needed. And then later in June, you would make a final decision on whether or not to amend the downtown urban renewal plan. As I've mentioned, if the plan is approved, implementation of the projects will be guided by the agency board. For housing projects, we come back to you to establish the development fee assistance program. We'd also bring back any possible property acquisitions and deal points. For physical improvements, agency board direction would be needed on projects over 250,000. And for emerging projects, agency board direction or initiation would be needed to implement these. In addition to these touch points, allocation of funds to projects would happen during your regular budget processes. And finally, the expenditure review panel will continue to provide community oversight to downtown urban renewal operations, annually reviewing expenditures in the district and providing a report to you. I'll end on the options for you today. You can choose to either formally initiate the plan amendment process, seeking feedback on spending scenario A, B, or C. You could seek feedback on a modified spending scenario, or you could take no action at this time. The agency director recommends option 1, and with that, we'll hand it to you for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We have just 15 minutes, so we'll have some questions. I think it's likely we'll need to roll over until Wednesday for the final. But are there questions or comments from counselors? Alan, Emily? Take it away, Alan and Greg. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. No secret, I'm not a big fan of the urban renewal mechanism and tax increment financing, but outnumbered on the council on that. In part because I think it's an unfair mechanism that and the projects can be done by other means. But in this particular time frame right now, I keep hearkening back to our budget deficit and our general fund deficit of $15 million. And we're looking at cutting services and potentially adding revenue to the general fund. And right now, adding money to the general fund has a lot of appeal for me. How much money would, if this were sunsetted, how much money would go to Eugene General Fund?
Based on fiscal year 22 data, about 1.3 million.
So $1.3 million would go into the general fund. That would reduce what we have to make up or cut with revenue or service reductions. Maybe the revenue team can look at this as a revenue measure to close the financial gap of the general fund. Or, and we haven't discussed it now, Mayor and I were talking about raising the floor, the frozen floor, that would also get money to the general fund. But I sense that that's not something that people want to look at, the majority anyway. In the alternative, I would think that we'd want to limit the time frame and the indebtedness right now and start small, and we can always come back and increase it over time if we want to. With regard to the projects, for me, if this is going to move forward, the first 3 projects should be housing, housing, and housing. And again, housing can be done with other mechanisms. But in this particular case, the money from the Urban Renewal District would go towards reducing SDCs and other fees that would make it more cost effective to be able to build in the downtown area, because it's more expensive to build on a square footage basis because of the density and other issues around downtown, right? And then also purchase land that could be used for housing. Totally support that. The physical improvements part, I'm okay with that. I think that should be limited to a large degree, but I do have concerns about the emerging projects list, in particular, 2 of them that are mentioned in attachment D, which isn't part of the packet that we're approving, but the emerging project list, in particular, the expansion of the convention center and the possibility of a new cultural performance center are things that I think we got the cart before the horse, including those. I think we haven't had any really open discussion about either of those types of projects, and putting them in here, I think, is way premature. I'd like to see those struck, but again, we're not approving attachment D, correct? It's just moving forward with the process of the amendment. But as we move forward, those two strike me as largely problematic in how we would move forward on with regard to merging projects. The other, open space and the Willamette Connection, Kesey Square, and revitalization of the park blocks, I think is great.
Thank you. Emily?
Thank you. I think that if we don't extend it, we're giving away half the money, whether it's going to the general fund or directly to downtown, and 4J will get hurt also. I have not been in favor of tax increment financing. I still have some problems with it, but I'm not as against it as I was before. It gets to be a little confusing about where the money's, coming and going to the general fund if we do it this way and then coming back, or if we just go directly. But I think that downtown really needs this, and I'm actually supportive of it. I don't feel ready to decide which level, and how long and how many millions, because the bigger ones are really big. It was only 19 million last time, and now we're talking about 30 for the first step. So I'd like to start the process, but I'm not ready to say today A, B, or C. Thank you for the work.
Okay, thank you. Greg, and then Jennifer.
Well, I'm not as against tax increment financing as Alan is, but I do agree with Alan on this point. This is probably one of the best tools, one of the few tools that we have to make major investments in housing, which is critical for what we have talked about for years, at least the last 10 years that I've sat on this council, and that is investment in housing in downtown, in the urban core that we need to build up, not out. And this is one of the few ways that we have to be able to make those kinds of investments. In addition to that, I've also been a big proponent about improving lighting downtown, improving other amenities downtown, and then the other third rail that we are reluctant to touch, and that is parking. We're going to have to deal with parking in one way or another. It's not going to be an easy conversation for us to do because we are, looking to try to reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible. But as we move forward, if we are not going to, look at restricting vehicle access downtown, or creating, no vehicle transportation zones that they've done in other cities, New York most notably lately, and in a lot of cities in New York. If we're not going to do that, which is not a thing that we do on the West Coast particularly well, then, we are going to have to really look at what kind of investments we're going to need to make in terms of parking, because we don't have parking now. So that's one of the pieces that is under my thinking in terms of consideration of this. And I think that we should start small and not go all the way up to the $50 million limit. But I could see us going $30 million and, with a limited time frame. I think, what is it, 11 years for the extension of the program. So, and then we can always revisit it as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. So I definitely agree with Greg that it's a extremely valuable tool when used properly, and that housing should really be our focus. And I also agree with Alan that I'm a little hesitant on some of these other projects that are in that third bucket. Like, I don't feel like I have the information that I need to know if those are appropriate to be in there or not. I do think that downtown is very important, and the investments we have been making need to continue. And it's an important part of our city that deserves that kind of ongoing attention. And I agree with Emily that knowing which of those three levels, I'm not sure I would be able to make that decision today. I tend to agree with Greg that starting smaller is probably better, but if there was information that made that, maybe, one of the larger ones is appropriate. I just don't feel like I'm in that space to make that decision today. I hope that's helpful.
Hey, thank you. Any other counselors with questions, comments? Oh, Grandy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm in support of going ahead with this. I certainly hear my colleagues saying they're concerned about one of the higher levels. Originally, as the council president, I was going to make a motion for option B, scenario B, but I was going to play with the money a little bit and try and move more into housing, because we need housing and we need compact housing, and downtown needs people in our downtown in order to transform that to where we need to go. So I'm a little bit in a quandary of what to do. I hate to make a motion that doesn't look like it has a lot of hope of passing. But at the same time, I do think we need to beef up. And I would like to see more than 14 million over 11 or 19 years or whatever we end up with, going towards making housing possible in our downtown.
Yeah, so just following that. So I do have a question. We could overflow to Wednesday, and I'm just wondering if there's a possibility for a little more description about some of those buckets, what the difference between A and B in terms of the physical improvements, and then a little more information about the third bucket of emerging projects might be helpful for council to sort of figure out where they want to land. And
yeah, I think that, and I think also giving you some examples of real costs that we're seeing right now, because I tend to agree with Councilor Groves, not saying I'm making a motion, but the dollars will go fast, especially when we're talking about housing, in particular, if we're talking about converting office building or office spaces to housing spaces. That's right. A change of use. And so I think that would give us an opportunity to bring back.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. And then I did just want to kind of highlight that the packet talks about the housing implementation pipeline. And so some of the numbers that you're talking about in this correlate to that. And that's whether we're talking about 700 units or 840, that goal was 1,000 units. And then also to Greg's comment about parking, the climate friendly and equitable communities put some brakes on what we can do in terms of parking downtown. So that's another I think a challenge as you see that as one of your downtown issues, kind of remembering that we're also in that place of trying to navigate parking requirements to fulfill state. So if there are no, yeah, Ellen. Oh, and Emily, sorry, I missed you. I apologize. Emily and then Ellen.
Thank you. Whichever total amount we decide to go on, we're not committed to the amount of money per bucket. So if you say $30 million, you could decide to put it all into housing, all into the park blocks. So what's in the buckets isn't really important to me. It would be useful to know what I can buy for that amount of buckets, which is going to make me want to move the 50 million closer to my desires. I also want to point out that the project list doesn't mean we're going to do all those projects, but if you don't put it on that list, then you can't. So realize that just because we put a convention center on there doesn't mean we're going to do a convention center. But if things shift and we all of a sudden get funding for a convention center and a little bit of urban renewal money would help, we would keep that option open to us. So I just want to be careful that we don't close ourselves off by deciding how much money per bucket and a limited number of projects being possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, I actually wasn't thinking of this in terms of dollar amounts. I was actually thinking in terms of time. So I'd like to know what the number would be if you just extended it 10 years. So it's like what, that would be like 29 million or something like that. But and I think that should be our parameter instead of the dollar amounts, how long we want it to keep going. And I agree with Randy, if we're going to do this, shifting to the housing bucket makes a lot of sense to me, which kind of leads me to wonder, these are pretty specific numbers, 3.6 and 2.6, but maybe that's just, those two were equal and you took out all the costs of administration and borrowing costs, took that out and then put 14 into housing and the rest is stability.
There's a lot of formulas that kind of are put into the model to come up with those numbers. I mean, we started out just with percentages that we want to, like for scenario A, we wanted to spend majority of the funds in housing and we'll break out the other two. The other two we want to spend half on housing. And so
yeah,
there's a lot of.
You could come back with more specificity on that. And then also on Wednesday, maybe we could come back and talk about, so Emily's right, this isn't the project list. Attachment D is not even what we're talking about. So what is the process for doing that? And how does that work? And if we say, we want most of this money, the vast majority of it to go to housing, how does that actually get implemented by the council? As opposed to things for physical improvements and emerging projects. And I'm not sure what emerging projects actually means. The two big ticket items are the conference center and the performance center, but the other stuff, I'm not sure what all that means.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Yes, Randy.
Just one more point. I actually do want to know where the money's going that we vote on. That does matter to me at least. And I've watched for too many years where I've watched council make aspirational goals that get put into writing that all of a sudden becomes law and we can't deviate from, and it just kind of magically transitions. So I want it really clear how much and where we intend it to go. And I agree with Councilor Zelenka. What is the length of time? I want it to be long enough time horizon that we can actually plan for and execute projects. And we know how long that takes. So whatever we do, I think it needs to be long enough that we can really do some robust planning around whatever we're going to do with whatever money we end up with.
Thank you. And I just have one other, Alan mentioned it briefly, this potential of increasing the frozen base and so freeing up some general fund money to maintain some of the things we've done. So that you're not proposing that we make that decision at this stage, but that would come back to us. Is that right?
That's part of my budget proposal. So that you're going to get that.
We'll get that
separate process.
Okay, that helps. Great. Okay, thank you. So we'll see you again on Wednesday. Thank you all very much. And with that, we are adjourned.